Hi. Confucius, the ancient Chinese philosopher, once observed that a common man marvels at uncommon things, while a wise man marvels at what seems most commonplace. I thought this quote, in some ways, captures something of the essence of this lecture, or the spirit of this lecture at least, which is going to be a lecture about thinking. And so the subject of this lecture, it might seem like something that's not even worth any kind of further consideration, thinking. We might just assume that there's no questions to be answered about thinking. It's something that's most common to us. Why would it warrant any further inquiry? At the same time, though, thinking seems to be one of these. At the same time as being most commonplace, it can also, I think, reveal itself to be one of the most enigmatic elements of our experience. There's something about thinking that it sort of eludes our grasp, and this could have something to do with, well, this fact itself could already reveal to us something about thinking. And so, just kind of at the outset here, before embarking on this undertaking or this exploration, I would like to just sort of establish the direction, or the direction, I guess, that I will try to take, which is not attempting to exactly arrive at any ultimate conclusions and answer the question, what is thinking, as such, but rather attempt to unfold the question, I guess, is a better way of thinking about it. So I will attempt to kind of reveal and explore the question itself, rather than attempting to conclude the question with an answer. And so, as I suggested, there's already something just in the first initial consideration of thinking. Something already begins to reveal itself about the essence of this phenomenon, which is that it seems impossible to get behind thinking. If we seek to understand something, the means by which we seek to understand it, the instrument or the method, it's always thinking itself. And so in some ways, if we hope to have any kind of success in this exploration of thinking, it will consist in somehow turning our thinking back upon itself in almost a reflexive way. One pictures almost the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail. In some way, thinking, there's no way to get before thinking or get behind thinking in the attempt to understand it. We have to rather, in some ways, again, apply thinking reflexively to its own activity. And so, as we go through this, in some ways, we're working on two planes at once, I guess, is a way to think about this. But we're sort of exploring thinking dialectically through concepts, but at the same time, this will be most successful if we can almost sustain a kind of overview of what we're doing at the same time as we're doing it. So as we explore this question with our thinking, we should also attempt to remain kind of reflexive and then also reflective after the fact. And as we go through this process, try to remember what we're doing so that we can think back on it and maybe learn something about thinking after the fact. One thing that could, another thing that could initially occur to us about thinking is that it seems impossible to really measure or quantify in the way that it's possible to quantify physical objects. Even the brain, for instance, which it's an organ that we ordinarily most directly or intimately associate with the process of thinking. You could certainly measure a brain in a laboratory and perform all sorts of physiological and physical tests of a brain, of the organ of a brain. And in fact, you could even imagine, it stretches the imagination, but you could even imagine somehow holding your own brain in your hands or something. And I know it stretches the imagination just like it would stretch all the nerves if you tried to keep your body functioning. But I think everyone can see what I'm saying in the sense that you can hold your brain in your hands, but you can't hold your thinking in your hands. And it just maybe suggests something that's obvious, but perhaps again so obvious that we cease to notice it, which is that the brain is a physical object. Thinking is not a physical object. Thinking is not an object in space exactly. Thinking it's somehow space is the brain is a spatially extended object. Thinking does not seem to be a spatially extended object. That observation that anybody can make, it's not so much an opinion as something that's just if your attention is if it's pointed out to you, you can simply experience it. That observation has led to at least sort of two basic responses, just kind of conventionally or commonly in the history of philosophy and science. And one of those responses is to sort of in some ways begin to discount thinking and begin to consider thinking as something that's somehow less real than what is tangible to us and what lends itself to scientific quantification. We might start to think of thinking as something that's subjective, or so something that's all in your head, so to speak. That it doesn't really have any sort of objective existence. And in those uses of the term, subjective would mean something like again, unreal, and objective would mean something like scientifically verifiable, something therefore more real than what is subjective. We might think of thinking as an experience, but not a reality. This has certainly been the approach of the greater part of the physical sciences, and certainly some philosophers, specifically philosophers of the empirical school, like Locke, for instance, and other empirical philosophers. These philosophers, largely in the tradition that we're familiar with in modern science. Another approach, though, which is so I think it's probably clear that this approach identifies or equates objectivity with tangibility and with reality. There's a kind of inverse approach to this, actually, which is arguably at least as valid and in some ways philosophically more valid than the first one. And that's to, rather than sort of discount thinking or, again, treat thinking as something like an afterthought. And so you have reality, and then you have thinking as something that's kind of follows after it, like almost like a shadow or something less real than its objects, the objects that thinking considers and thinks about. This other approach has rather taken almost it's almost a reciprocal or inverse image of the first approach, and that takes the departure point of what is most immediate to our experience, and that happens to be, and again, this is not so much an opinion as something that is self-evident to somebody whose attention is drawn to this fact. What is most immediate to us seems to be not physical objects, spatial objects at all, but rather our own experience of those objects. And thinking seems to be almost like the constitutive element or the substance of our experience. Even of the most objective things, we still again in some ways can't step outside of our experience of them. Things, even scientific things, they're always presented to us in the form or in the substance of our experience, and this has kind of led other schools to again sort of stand the first image on its head and say rather it's thinking that is most real and subjective, but subjective in the sense that it depends on a subject, not in the sense that it's unreal. Thinking is subjective in the sense that it obviously it depends on a subject to do the thinking, but thinking it's also what most immediately presents itself to us. And so in some ways, empiricism, the term, in some ways it's almost can almost begin to seem like a kind of misapplication of that term. And if we really wish to be true to our experience, we might have to begin with thinking and try to work our way back to the objects of physical science, spatial objects, spatially extended objects, things we can measure. We always experience those things through our thinking. These philosophers that have taken this approach, some famous philosophers are Immanuel Kant and George Berkeley. just to name a few. And there are many different variations of these two themes, but I just wanted to kind of present, not exactly as caricatures, but as sort of paradigms of two different approaches that we could take. In the first case, subjective is thinking is considered something subjective, and subjective it has a connotation of unreal. This is contrasted to objective things, which are somehow real because they lend themselves to scientific measurement and quantification. The other side is to say thinking is subjective, yes, but it's subjective in the sense that it depends on a subject, and in fact, for that reason, it's most real because it's the most immediate thing to our experience, and everything downstream of that immediate intuition of thinking is even if it's objective, it's still somehow dependent on this immediate subjective intuition of thinking. And so these, I guess, are two sort of two initial approaches that we might take following that observation that thinking is not something we can grab with our hands, so to speak, or examine under a microscope. Certainly you could examine the brain under a microscope, but what you would discover is not thinking. You would discover, as you would expect, you would discover all kinds of physical and physiological and chemical processes going on in the brain. What you would not discover is thinking. Thinking is something apparently that's qualitatively different than whatever you could measure in a brain. And then we might think, well, okay, thinking is something subjective, and even though it's kind of most immediate to us, it's still the fact that it's subjective means that it might not be possible to, even though it's most immediate to me, certainly my thinking is not most immediate to the next person, and therefore we might say, sure, it has some kind of reality for me, but it might be impossible for me to sort of step into something common, intersubjective, or even objective with thinking. We might think thinking, sure, it can be real if it's subjective, but it could never be objective. We might think there's a kind of objective world out there, and that's something that we might be kind of only touch as a kind of limiting case, and not really be able to inhabit that objective world with our thinking. And in some way, then you would picture everybody in kind of little, almost like little bubbles or something. And this is in some ways something of a caricature, but it begins to resemble an image of a kind of cosmology by a famous philosopher called Leibniz. He envisioned everybody in a kind of in what he called monads. The idea of it's a kind of like sphere of consciousness or something, and they all are somehow they never really interact with one another. This might be we might be led to this kind of view of thinking, which is despite that it can certainly be it's kind of like immediately presents itself to our experience, more immediate than anything that we consider real. So thinking you might have to consider thinking something super real because it's just so immediate to us. In fact, it's so immediate to us that we often don't see it. We rather see through it, as I will try to explain in a moment. But that might actually not be the most accurate way of looking at this, and the reason I say that is because in some way thinking it's not only is it the most immediate thing to our experience, but it's also the way we actually conceptualize and categorize objectivity as such. In fact, if we did not have the ability to think, we wouldn't have the ability to communicate about any objective things. I'll try to show what I mean by this kind of picture or an example. And so suppose that three different people stand to face east on the spring solstice, or the spring equinox, and they face the sunrise on the spring equinox, and sure enough, the sun comes up over the hills, and the sun kind of crests the hill, and you have that kind of iconic spring sunrise. And now suppose these three people have very different sort of conceptions of what kind of thing a sunrise is. And let's just take three conceptions that are in some ways different but also commensurable. You might imagine, for instance, these are all going to be roughly, geometric or scientifical conceptions of the solar system. You might, though, of course, imagine, a poet and an engineer and a theoretical physicist. But that's not what we're going to do. We're just going to imagine three people that are seeing the sunrise, but they're perceiving the same sunrise. But one of them is a Ptolemaic astronomer, a geocentricist. And so this person is seeing the sunrise and seeing the sunrise. What he or she is seeing is the sun rising as it orbits around the Earth. The second of these three individuals is a Copernican, a heliocentrist. This person believes in this the sun-centered picture of the solar system, and so this person it actually sees the Earth spinning on its axis as it rotates the sun, and so that's the second person's view. Again, they're standing. Let's imagine they're standing in the same place, and we might just for the sake of the thought experiment, nobody has to be harmed in this thought experiment. Obviously, that's the virtue of thought experiments. Let's imagine they're using the same eyes to see this. And that's just so that we we don't have to we can kind of isolate the variables. Let's say the third mind that's looking through these eyes is actually a kind of we might call galactrocentrist. This person conceptualizes the solar system itself as something that is orbiting around the center of the Milky Way. At millions of miles per hour, spinning in the third arm of the Milky Way galaxy. And now here's the question that we could ask, and again, this is trying to relate this to our initial query of whether of the relation of thinking as something subjective to objectivity. The question is, well, first of all, I guess it's worth pointing out that they're actually seeing the same thing with their eyes, and I think this is something that's easy to overlook. They're seeing the same thing with their eyes. There's no apparent difference between seeing the sunrise or seeing the Earth turn, right? The Earth turn and the sunrise, they actually they look exactly the same. You might say, and for instance, the geocentricist might say. Might argue on behalf of his or her theory by saying, just look at the obvious evidence. It looks like the sun is rising. So why would we imagine that in fact we're the ones spinning when you can manifestly see the sun spinning? And the heliocentricist might say something like, what would you imagine it to look like if in fact the Earth were spinning? And the answer can only be that it looks just like what it looks like. This example, though, it can reveal to us something, which is that when we actually, what we're actually seeing is much less a function of what's coming in through our eyes, and much more a function of, there are different ways of thinking about this, but much more a function of what is transpiring in our minds. We might differentiate perception from conception, and say that in some ways we can only really perceive what we can conceive. You imagine each of them, in a basic sense, in a physiological sense, was only actually experiencing through his or her senses, was only experiencing stimuli of the nervous system, which in themselves don't mean anything, and they're neither one kind of sunrise nor another kind of sunrise. They're just nerve impulses firing. And so everything after that is actually a function of our thinking. And so it's really impossible actually anymore. Once we gain some kind of insight into this fact, it's really impossible anymore to entertain the illusion that thinking is somehow something unreal or something of an afterthought. It seems rather to be something like the condition for almost like transcendentally real, like real before, super real or primarily real. It's in some ways prior to reality, the thinking, and even the fact that those three individuals seeing the sunrise on the spring equinox, the fact that they could even argue about their respective positions, it presupposes some kind of objectivity in thinking. The fact that one another could understand their own disagreements. This just shows that they're able to transcend the kind of solipsistic view of thinking, which is that it's all independently in their heads. And so, in some ways, thinking it's not only the most immediately subjective thing, in the sense that it's most immediately dependent on a subject, and also most immediately evident to a subject. It's you don't have to go and seek anywhere for thinking. It's if you were to go somewhere, it's what you would seek with. So it's always right there with you. So not only is it the most eminently subjective thing, but it's the most eminently objective thing too. And my illustration with the three individuals watching the sunrise was an attempt to illustrate that. I said, suppose they're seeing with the same eyes for the sake of isolating variables. Now suppose that in fact they're seeing, as we would imagine three different individuals seeing, with three different eyes. Let's just change the thought experiment and imagine they're all heliocentrists, so they're all seeing the Earth spin in some ways rather than the sunrise, and they know that the way it looks when the Earth spins is just the way that it would look to somebody who thought the sun was rising, that it looks just the same way to their eyes. Now, let's just consider that each of those three persons is standing in a slightly different place and likely has slightly different physiological parameters, both in the shape and the dimensions of the eye, the lens, the cornea, the pupil, and so on. Also, these people are obviously not standing in identical places. They're standing in a little bit different places, a little bit different lighting situations, and so on. And so then we realize that, in fact, their immediate sensory stimuli of this event might share almost nothing in common. Not the least because they're all registering these sensory stimuli through different nervous systems. They're not, keep in mind, they're not sharing the same nervous system anymore as they were in the first example. So in the second example, in fact, what they're experiencing physiologically are totally different. They are fundamentally different. Again, if for no other reason than these are three different nervous systems that are again kind of registering these stimuli. Okay. And so once again, we discover that it's only by virtue of thinking that they're able to experience the same sunrise on March 21st, the spring equinox, the sunrise of the spring equinox. It's only by virtue of something beyond the nervous system and beyond the brain. It's only in virtue of their thinking that they're able to experience the same thing at all. Because again, what's happening in terms, if we had to describe it in purely physiological terms, these are three different nervous systems firing in as three different nervous systems. There's nothing that connects these nervous systems unless we're willing to entertain the idea of thinking as the kind of arbiter of objectivity. And so, beginning from from the starting point, which is thinking might just be something kind of like like an appendix or an afterthought to what is real, we've kind of almost come to the opposite conclusion, which is thinking is somehow like transcendentally real, more real than whatever we think is real. Okay, and so I hope that has given us something to consider, and more than saying this is a fact. It's my sort of intention with this kind of lecture is to invite anyone who's listening to consider this possibility and not believe it or disbelieve it, but rather entertain it for the sake of discovering what it might reveal through your own experience, not through my experience. I'm not intending to tell one person or another this is the way it is, but rather again invite invite insight on your behalf. And so that's, I guess, that's kind of that concludes, I guess, one chapter of this lecture. What I would like to now do is something a little bit more theoretical, and by that I just mean I'd like to propose for us a sort of model or paradigm to begin to explore the nature of thinking, and how it sort of joins the objective and the subjective, the outer and the inner, the material and the immaterial, depending on how you want to say these things. And so that's going to be in the second part of this lecture. I'm going to try to at least propose something along those lines. And so I guess just to sort of from the outside as a kind of keynote, I'm going to compare or sort of try to employ the analogy of language to shed light on the nature of perception and reality and truth and knowledge as such. And so just to clarify what I have in mind, or expand on what I proposed, if we are confronted with a page of text, for instance, we're able to differentiate a couple things. And to begin with, we see the text, and we can discover that it's immediately evident to our senses that here you have a page with all kinds of shapes on the page, but we also we don't assume that the shapes. How would I say this? We regard, or we have a sort of intentionality, an approach, kind of cognitive gesture, cognitive posture that we take towards the printed page, that we assume that it means something, and so we don't just sort of feast our eyes on the shapes of the letters, right? We rather, quite on the contrary, in fact, when we really read something, if we're really going to regard it as language or as text, that implies that we actually see beyond the letters. Otherwise, we would call it, we would think of it as a picture book or something. That's different. We're actually, if we're going to read something, if we're going to regard it as language, we actually are able to regard the outer sign as a sort of symbol or a gesture for an inner meaning. And by outer, I just mean what is perceptible to our physical senses, and by inner, I mean what is only apprehensible through thinking. And so when we read something, that's exactly what we're doing. We're in some ways joining an outer sign. We're joining that to an inner understanding. We might imagine it's like the letters tell our they tell our understanding which forms and which configurations to take. The letters are a kind of instruction for our consciousness and for our thinking, and in that way we're actually able to participate in the same ideas and the same meanings that the author had intended, more or less. And of course there will be exceptions, but the exceptions are not they prove the rule in some way, because we're able to recognize the exceptions, and that means we have some kind of standard to judge them against. The exceptions prove the rule. They suggest something that thinking or understanding can be regarded in a way perfectly analogous to the way that we different people will have if people stand in a circle around an elephant. The elephant will look different to all of the people standing in a circle around it, but they're able to recognize that it's a single elephant that they're all seeing different sides of. In the same way, we can say that even if people understand a text differently, we still recognize that it's the same text that they're understanding. Okay, and so we can use spatial metaphors to understand something that's fundamentally not spatial. The idea of kind of truth or reality as a text. This is just an extension of what we've discovered about reading, which is again something that we're confronted with sensory sign, and we meet that sensory sign with an internal or non-sensory immaterial, and I'm just referring to however we describe thinking, whatever qualities we ascribe to thinking. It's certainly not made of matter, and it's certainly not something we see with our physical senses. It seems to be something non-physical, non-spatial, certainly. And so again, through thinking, we're able to connect what confronts us through our senses to meaning, for lack of a better word. We're able to make a meaning out of what is merely at first, again, nothing other than stimulation of our nervous systems. Yeah. One way of thinking about this is that we can only perceive what we can conceive. Because if we imagined that we could perceive without conceiving, we would be back at a situation where we're actually just our retinas are being tickled by light, and that's the end of it. And that itself, stimulation of the nervous system, it's not about anything. It's just a physical, it's just a fact happening in the physical world. It's only once we add thinking into our concept of this that we're able to recognize that, in fact, the stimulation of our nervous system means something. Yeah. And that's the process of sense making, of perception. And that's the process by which we make contact with what is real. And so we can carry, though, this analogy from reading and from confronting a text. We can actually, and this is what I was suggesting as a kind of theory. By theory, I don't mean something like a conjecture. I mean I mean a way of seeing. I've already, I hope, established that we don't exactly see with our eyes. We see through our eyes, but we see with our thinking and with our ideas, with our concepts, with our theories. And so that's the purpose of this analogy of perception to reading. It's for the sake of serving as a theory, in the hopes that we might be able to see something with it. Okay, and so this theory the idea would be in the same way that we are confronted with letters, our physical senses are confronted with letters, and those letters invoke in us understanding, and they invoke ultimately meaning for us. In the same way, we're confronted with stimulation of our physical senses by the physical world, but we sort of complete this stimulation of our physical senses. We're able to complete or to complement that with our thinking, and that again, the result of that is that we have meaningful experience. So our experience becomes meaningful, it becomes objective in some sense. We're making contact with something true and something objective. And this is actually not a recent thought. It's an ancient thought, in fact, and it goes back to thinkers like Heraclitus and ancient thinkers. Heraclitus lived close to 3,000 years ago. Thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, thinkers like John the Evangelist, who began his most famous work, the Gospel according to John, begins with the phrase "en arche no logos." In the beginning was the Word. Word is a translation of logos, and logos is maybe, word is, in some ways, word can be misleading because it seems so familiar to us. It's like, I know what a word is, so I don't have to think about it. Logos, it's an unfamiliar term because it's in Greek, but it can invite us to actually inquire more deeply into the nature of language as such. Logos could be a translation for word, obviously, as it most often is in the case of English translations of the Gospel of John. But it can also be translated. The concept of logos seems to be much more expansive in scope than the English term word, and in fact, logos has been understood to encompass many, like a whole diversity of terms in English. So for the Greeks, a single term actually has a scope that encompasses such terms as, like I suggested, word, language, speech, reason, argument, proportion, ratio, reason. Even Heraclitus seemed to use logos, and John seemed to be using it in the same way, as something like ordering principle. I've thought of logos as an indication of internal coherence. And so if you think of a piece of music, you see the way in which it organizes itself internally, so that one note relates in a kind of like an internal structure to all of the other notes, and that's itself what makes it a coherent piece of music, and not separate pieces of music with every new note or every new instant. The fact that it becomes comprehensive and coherent as a single piece of music, that's due to logos. And so logos, in some way, it's the kind of principle of coherence of something, internal coherence, and not just it's the difference between something. It's not. So if you think of a song, for instance, it's not just an aggregation of sounds. We wouldn't call that a song. We would just call that we wouldn't refer to it as anything itself, because it would just be merely it wouldn't have any internal organization and it wouldn't have any kind of identity. Logos could be thought of as, like I suggested, the principle of internal coherence, and that's another way of saying actually identity. Okay, and we see this by analogy with language. If we even just consider the way, if you encounter the letters THINKING, you recognize that it's not just an arbitrary sequence that those letters have. They actually work together in a kind of organic way, internally coherent way, and that actually the letters they band together in a kind of community, and they form a word. They form something. They form a meaning. They form a meaning together in a coherent way. That's the same thing as forming an identity. Okay, and so logos, logos is a kind of, it's an entry point into something quite vast vision of what kind of place, what kind of role that thinking and can play in, that does play in our experience of reality, and also in reality itself. And so I suggested that the idea of speech or language as an analogy, logos as an analogy, or actually as the reality of the physical world, the kind of the meaning of the physical world, certainly. That I suggest that that's an ancient idea. It's not a new idea, certainly, with me. I wanted to share, though, actually something that I have come across that's somewhat more recent expression of the same kind of insight. And I think this is it's especially illustrative, precisely because this author, Helen Keller is her name. She wasn't alluding to any of these ancient traditions. She was in some ways trotting an original path. She shortly after she was born, she lost both her sense of vision and her sense of hearing, and she was blind. So she was blind and deaf. And she describes, actually, in this short chapter, I'm going to read a small excerpt. It's I believe it's chapter 5 in her autobiography, called "A Story of My Life." She describes the moment that she describes her epiphanic moment in which she grasps the nature of language. So she had lived to be about 6 years old before she grasped the nature of language, and this is really one of the most stirring and striking expressions of the power of logos, actually. And logos, just like I suggested, thinking and logos both, there's something that's actually almost sort of so immediate to us that we don't really notice it. We notice everything else through logos, but logos itself, we again, it's so close to us. Maybe it's closer to us than we are to ourselves in some ways. So I'm just going to read this short excerpt from Helen Keller's biography. I believe this is again chapter 5. She's describing actually walking together with her teacher. She says, "We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand." Her teacher's name is Miss Sullivan. "My teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, my teacher spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention transfixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly," says Helen Keller, "I felt a misty consciousness, as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that water meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that could in time be swept away. I left the well house eager to learn," she says. "Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. That was because I saw everything with the strange new sight that had come to me." This sight is, of course, the light of logos, the light of language. We might think of language as something in the same way that you need shelves to put your books on. We use language to order our thoughts, and so language, again, it's a kind of they're sort of containers for thoughts, is a way to think about it. Containers for concepts. So I hope that the connection with Helen Keller's biography or autobiography, I hope that the connection to that is clear. That I hope that connection to what we've covered up until this point in this lecture is self-evident. That's probably a good place actually to draw this to a close. I did want to address one final element of this theme, which is if thinking is really somehow not merely in my head, not merely subjective, but actually also in some ways constitutes, in some ways it's what actually allows us to distinguish the concepts of subjectivity and objectivity themselves. Again, thinking is somehow anterior, logos is somehow anterior to both of these notions in the first place. The way we're able to categorize some things as subjective and some things as objective, that itself depends on thinking, on logos. And so, but I did just want to address something that, again, this is an observation that a person might make, and it might seem difficult to place this in the context, and it might seem like it might throw a wrench in the spokes of this design, this theory, and that's the idea that, or that's the apparent fact that no, people do really have different experiences of what would seem to be the same thing. And that might initially, again, kind of cast doubts over whether thinking can really serve as the arbiter of objectivity. I've already, in some ways, addressed this question, in terms of people having different viewpoints on the elephant, but still recognizing that it's the same elephant. But I also think that William Blake actually gives a very expressive way for us to address what could seem like an objection to this, and he's just pointing out that we everything that we meet it according to itself, but also according to who we are. And this is in a letter that he wrote in 1799. He writes everyone does not see alike. He says, to the eyes of a miser, a gold coin is far more beautiful than the sun itself, and a bag worn with the use of money has more beautiful proportions than a vine filled with juicy grapes. The tree which moves some to tears of joy is in the eyes of others only a green thing which stands in the way. Some see in nature all ridicule and deformity, and by these I shall not regulate my proportions. And some scarce see nature at all. But to the eyes of a man with imagination, nature is imagination itself. Blake concludes, he says, as a man is, so he sees. And I thought this was a especially poignant way to express just the fact that what we see is not only a function of what we're seeing, but also how we're seeing. In other words, what kind of persons that we are that see in one way or the other. And we can imagine three people looking at a tree. I said about the sunrise, but we can just conclude, kind of draw this into close the circle here, and imagine like a poet, a lumberjack, and a botanist. Three people looking at a forest, and you realize that forest or tree. Suppose they're just looking at a single tree, a birch tree maybe, a lumberjack, a poet, and a botanist. They're going to see, obviously, they in some ways they see the same thing, and in another way they see entirely different things. And so I hope that at least, again, I don't think that we've come to any kind of resting place in any kind of conclusive statements that we can make, but that might not be the kind of thing that knowledge really is anyway. It's much less a question of becoming familiar with something, developing capacities of experience, rather than thinking of knowledge as propositional content or data or information that we can just accumulate. Even if that were the case, it would still depend on us to be able to interpret and make sense and make meaning out of that information. So it's that idea of thinking of knowledge, a theory of knowledge that treats knowledge as propositional content or information. It's entirely inadequate to the object, to knowledge itself. It's just not an adequate theory to understand the nature of knowledge. And I hope that with this lecture, that's also served to shed light on thinking, and also helps us to see how conceptualizing knowledge as information is simply not. It's not an accurate way of thinking about it, and instead we have to think of knowledge as something much more like understanding, and understanding is something that we once again achieve or attain, win through to by way of none other than thinking about it. And so I hope that in some ways we've accomplished that today with this lecture, and so that's where I will draw this to a close, and not before, of course, wishing everybody the best until next time, and farewell from me.